Welcome to the October meeting of the Greenwich Representative Town Meeting. My name is Tom Byrne, RTM moderator. As all members have received a copy of the call for tonight's meeting, the reading of the call will be omitted. Will everyone please rise and join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. As all members have received a copy of the minutes of our September 18 meeting, the reading of the minutes will be omitted. Are there any suggested changes to those minutes? Hearing none and absent objection, the minutes as submitted stand adopted upon unanimous consent. Pam Frederick, Chair of our Finance Committee.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, the RTM Finance Committee would just like to extend an invitation to RTM members and general public for a special meeting that we will hold in November, so we won't have a November recess. We'll be meeting the evening of November 13th at 7:30 p.m. in the Cone Room. We'll be meeting with the Public Works Department and several town officials to discuss the Public Works budget process, the process for allocating contracts, and in particular we have been concerned over the course of the last couple of years with a number of additional appropriations that we've had. So we're using that meeting to discuss those items with Public Works and hope that many of you will attend. The Public Works Committee has agreed to join us as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Val Stouffer, Chair of District 7.
Virginia Obrig and I met first back in 1982 when we joined District 10 RTM together. 2 decades later, when we were both on District 7, we celebrated her 90th birthday. Tonight, it is my sad duty to tell you that she passed away this month, and I'm going to read a resolution in her honor from District 7. Whereas Virginia Morgan Obrig, a member of this body for 20 years, passed away on October 8, 2006, at the age of 97. And whereas Jenny Obrig served District 7 with distinction from 1986 until 2002, after previously serving since 1982 as a member of District 10. She represented our district on 3 committees: Education, Social Services, and Health and Environment, which later became known as the Health and Human Services Committee. For 3 terms, Ginny had the honor of being the Secretary of the Education Committee. Her expertise in this field made her an invaluable member of the committee. She had taught at Greenwich High School, had volunteered on the Glenville School PTA, and was a member of the board of the Association of Retired Teachers. Ginny believed in the importance of strong academic achievement and is known to a generation of students who enrolled in her rigorous SAT prep course that she conducted for 10 years after her retirement in 1974. Ginny dedicated many hours as a volunteer at Nathaniel Wetherell. She served as president of the auxiliary and was a member of the Nathaniel Board of Directors. Her hands-on experience in the field of aging gave her unique insight as a member of the Greenwich Adult Daycare Committee. Ginny served as president of Church Women United of Greenwich and was a member of the chaplaincy services of Greenwich. Our District 7 delegation was fortunate to have as members both Ginny and her daughter Alice, who contributed her own professional knowledge of health care. The Obrigs brought both expertise and compassion to our District 7 discussions on items pertaining to education, social needs, and health issues. Greenwich has lost a citizen who served us all in the best tradition of the volunteer representative town meeting. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the entire membership of the Greenwich Representative Town Meeting join District 7 in honoring Virginia Obrig's exemplary and productive life and further extend our sympathy to the Obrig family. Be it further resolved that this resolution be set forth in the minutes of this meeting and that a proper copy, therefore, be prepared by the town clerk and sent to her family. Thank you.
Will the members please rise and join me in a moment of silence in memory of Virginia Obrig? Thank you. Bob Richardson, Chair of the Special Committee on the Nathaniel Witherell.
Mr. Moderator, thank you, Mr. Moderator. I've just come from a Nathaniel Witherell board meeting, and I'd just like to note that I think they're doing a variety of extremely good things and working at their job very carefully and very productively. This evening, apart from the nomination of Dr. Scarper to the board, we have no items concerning Nathaniel Witherell. But at our December meeting, we will probably be asked to take up 2 charter changes which have been proposed by the board to rationalize the process for appointing a building committee and to align the town approval process more closely with that of the State Department of Social Services. The 2 amendments relate to Witherell's new building proposal, which has been named Project Renew Witherell. That is a $36.8 million combination renovation and new building proposal designed to eliminate the major deficiencies which now exist in the physical plant and for which the board has requested a placeholder in the capital improvement program budget for 2007-2008. The board has also begun discussions with the employees' representatives, which may in due course lead to substantial cost restructuring and which will be a key component, if so, of a revised business plan expected to be presented to the RTM in mid-December. The special committee urges the board to address the governance issue in this plan as well. As I suggested, the board has worked assiduously in the last 2 years to master its knowledge and to run a nursing home. And on the whole, the results are not just favorable, but they are impressive. It is now time to come to grips with the governance question, which the committee continues to regard as an integral part of any successful plan for Project Renew Witherell. It should be a carefully conceived transition to a not-for-profit governance upon completion of the renovation and new construction in 2011. The committee stands ready to assist them in every way possible and to assist other members of the RTM in understanding this issue and in reaching a satisfactory conclusion before this body. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I've been asked to announce a debate sponsored by the League of Women Voters, which will be held this Wednesday, October 25th. It will be held at the Greenwich Town Hall Meeting Room. There will be a meet and greet the candidates, and these are the candidates for the 151st State House seat and the 36th State Senatorial seat. There will then be a debate of the House candidates, Ed Crummick and Dolly Powers, at 7:30, and a debate of the Senate candidates, Frank Farraker and Bill Nickerson, at 8:15. So that is this Wednesday at the Greenwich Town Hall Meeting Room. All right, that now brings us to the call for tonight's meeting. And based on the reports of our districts and committees, it is my intention to place 5 of the items on our call on our consent calendar. Those will be items 4, 8, and I'll come back and give the details of what each is. but just as an overview, the consent calendar items that I will propose will be 4, 8, 11, 13, and 14. I will suggest a motion to combine items 2, 3, and 16. And there have been a total of 5 items that have been withdrawn tonight, leaving just items 1, 7, and 12, if all goes as I just suggested, to be considered separately. The items that have been withdrawn are items 5, 6, 9, 10, and 15. And Jim Lash, our first selectman, will explain briefly the circumstances regarding the withdrawal of item 10. Mr. Lash.
Good evening, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. As you all know from the email traffic over the last week or two, there's been a lot of what I think is very constructive conversation going on about the wording of item 10, as well as obviously conversation about whether we should adopt it or not. As you know, I feel strongly we should adopt it. But I do think we should adopt something that has wording on which we all can agree. And therefore, I've asked the moderator to allow us to withdraw this item, and my intention is to appoint a small working group, including several members of the RTM who've indicated a strong interest in this item, to recraft the wording, and we will have this item back for you on the December call if that's acceptable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, that now brings us to our consent calendar. And it was the consensus of all reporting districts and committees that the following 5 items be considered on our consent calendar, which by rule does not have any committee reports or discussion. We simply take a vote on all of the items placed on that calendar. The first item is item 4, which is the appointment of Nancy Kaplan to be a member of the Board of Parks and Recreation with a term expiring March 31, 2010. The second item is item 8. That is the appointment of Francis Scarpa to be a member of the Nathaniel Witherell Board with a term expiring March 31, 2009. Item 11 is the acceptance of a grant of $10,308 to fund the education of displaced Hurricane Katrina students. Item 13 is the acceptance of a gift in the amount of $25,000. And we really should publicize. Is that Greenwich Capital or USB now? Greenwich Capital Markets? Royal Bank of Scotland. We've got it. Okay. $25,000 to fund this year's 2006 July 4th fireworks. And item 14 Item 14 is the acceptance of several gifts totaling $38,270 from the Parks and Recreation Foundation, from Summer Rain Sprinkler System, and from the Friends of Greenwich Point. Now, pursuant to our rule, those items will remain on the consent calendar unless there is an objection supported by 20 or more members. Is there any objection to the placement of any of those 5 items on our consent calendar? Hearing none, will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Consent calendar items 4, 8, 11, 13, and 14. And please proceed to poll your delegation. There were 3 items that also seemed not to be controversial, but the 2 items, items 2 and 3, regarding the Community Development Block Grant require a public hearing, which is why we're not putting them on the consent calendar. So it was the consensus of those reporting that we suspend the rules to combine the following items for voting purposes. Items 2 and 3, which pertain to the Community Development Block Grant, and item 16, which was the Historic District Study Committee, which was sent under separate mailing. Is there such a motion to suspend the rules to combine those three items for voting purposes? It has been moved and seconded to suspend the rules and combine items 2, 3, and 16 for voting purposes. The motion to suspend the rules is not debatable, and it requires a 2/3 majority to pass. All those in favor of suspending the rules to combine items 2, 3, and 16 for voting purposes, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? That motion is carried. So the first two, we will take items 2 and 3 together. And let me just reiterate, after we have voted on the combined items, the only items remaining will be to consider separately are items 1, 7, and 12. All right, may we get the resolutions on items 2 and 3? Nancy Brown, Director of Community Development.
Mr. Moderator, town meeting members, resolution number 2 is a resolution of the resolution of the Board of Estimate authorizing the appropriation of the funds for the Community Development Program for 2007. The funds expected would be $925,000 in the grant and another $38,718 in a loan repayment. Item number 3 is a resolution of the First Selectman seeking town meeting's request to apply for the grant, and I so submit those two resolutions to the town meeting.
Thank you. Will the member please move the adoption of items 2 and 3? Resolutions on items 2 and 3 have been moved and seconded. At this point, I will, because these items require a public hearing, I will at this time open the public hearing and will first call for the committee reports on this item. Pam Frederick, Chair of our Finance Committee.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, the item was presented to the Finance Committee at our meeting on Monday, October 16th by Nancy Brown, Director of Community Development. In the item, we would recommend a substitute resolution at the appropriate time to clarify the language, which such resolution has been agreed by the Director, Nancy Brown. We received clarification at the meeting of the use or the source of the $38,000 loan repayment was originally to fund Parsonage Cottage, and the repayments become part of the funding for the department. It was also clarified that all of the programs are for Greenwich residents, except that there are a few regional programs which those regional programs also go to support Greenwich residents, namely the homeless shelter in Stamford. One of the new programs this year is the Liberations Program, which supports Latino youth. The emphasis is in this community development block grant is on capital improvement projects, which represents about 2/3 of the budget. However, 15 public service programs are also supported. The committee voted 12-0-0 in favor of both resolutions 2 and 3. Thanks.
Thank you. And did I hear you say you have an amendment to offer?
Substitute resolution.
Oh.
Should I do that now?
Well, why don't we get our committee reports, and I'll come back to you for that. Gerald Isaacson, Chair of our Health and Human Services Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Health and Human Services met also with Nancy Brown. Excuse me. And she led us through the process that is used to develop these grants. It's clear that the size of the grants have been sort of up and down, but have, over the last 5 years, showed a trend downward. Last year, for example, the grant amounted to $1,189,277, whereas this year it's expected to be $963,718. The largest grant is $250,000 to the Town Hall Annex with 28 residences for a new hot water system. The smallest were 3 $5,000 grants to Family Center and Adult Daycare for various programs. This is a carefully considered allocation of funds, and I think it's interesting to point out that the requests for these funds totaled well over $3 million. The amount to be distributed is $963,718. Our vote was 12-0-0.
Thank you. Mr. Wells, with the report of our Legislative and Rules Committee.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, our committee took this item up jointly with Finance Committee last Monday evening. Appearing was Nancy Brown for both of our committees. I don't have much to add except that Nancy Brown did, in fact, point out what really is a grammatical error in one of the resolutions that Pam Frederick is going to offer by way of an amendment. And so we voted as amended by the Finance Committee, and our own committee amended it as well. It was 11-0-0.
Thank you. Ms. Frederick, would you like to offer that amendment?
The amendment is basically a clarification to the language that makes it agree with the intent. And that is in item number 2, the second further resolved, in the third line that reads, or if the entitlement, we would suggest, or if either the entitlement is less than the projected 925, or, instead of and, the loan repayment is less than $38,718. And basically it just means that if either of those items comes in below than expected, that all of the programs would be reduced on a pro rata basis. So we're just trying to get the language to agree with the intent.
All right, thank you. Does everyone understand what the motion to amend is? Do we need to go over it again?
Should I repeat?
Okay.
Okay. And
I'll read it.
Oh, you will? Okay,
Thank
great.
you. This is a motion offered on behalf of one of our committees, so it does not require a second. The motion to amend is on page 2 of our call, the page marked page 2 of 7, and it's in the second to last paragraph on that page. Further resolved that in the event the entitlement amount should be more, that's how the paragraph begins. In line 3, the first word is item, comma, and it now reads, or if the entitlement is less. The proposed amendment is to insert the word either after the word if. So it would read, or if either the entitlement is less than the projected $925,000. And in place of the word and, substitute or. So if either the entitlement is less than the projected $925,000 or the loan repayment, etc. Is that correct, Ms. Frederick? Okay, so those are the two changes that are proposed by the pending motion to amend. We can adopt amendments upon unanimous consent. Is there any, first of all, any questions on what is before us? Is there any objection to that proposed amendment? Hearing none, that motion to amend may be adopted upon unanimous consent. So items 2 and 3 are now before us. Discussion on those items. Once again, I remind everyone that I opened a public hearing on those items. Since it does not appear anyone is interested in addressing us on it at the moment, we'll continue and take up the last of the combined items, but I will hold the public hearing open until we have finished with this last item. And if anyone in the meanwhile comes in who would like to address us, I will recognize them. All right, item 16 now comes before us. Ed Gomo, Town Administrator.
Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM, item 16 is 2 resolutions. Resolve, the representative town meeting appoint the Historic District Commission as Historic District Study Committee for the purpose of investigating a proposed historic district on Sachem Road in Greenwich in accordance with Section 7-147B of the Connecticut General Statutes. And resolve, the representative town meeting appoint the Historic District Commission as Historic District Study Committee for the purpose of investigating a proposed historic district on Taconic Road in Stanwich in accordance with Section 7-147B of the Connecticut General Statutes.
Thank you. Will a member please move the adoption of the resolution? The resolution on item 16 has been moved and seconded. Franklin Bloomer with the report of our Land Use Committee.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members of town meeting. Item 16 deals with the creation of a historic district committee, or two historic district committees, to consider the creation of historic districts in two areas of town. The first area is Sachem Road in Cascab. Sachem Road is to the east of and parallel to Indian Field Road, south of the Post Road. The second area is Taconic Road, roughly in the area between North and South Stanwich Roads. This is the first step in a two-step procedure. Establishment of historic districts comes back to the RTM for the adoption of an ordinance establishing the district after certain procedures which are described in the explanos have been carried out. The first step is the preparation of a report on the topics that are described in the explanos. The state then conducts a secret poll of homeowners in the area to be included in the districts, requiring that two-thirds of those homeowners approve. If a historic district is established, there are restrictions placed on what homeowners can do with their properties. These are intended to preserve the historic character of the district. The town has two historic districts, one on Strickland Road in Cascab and the second in the backcountry around Buckfield Lane and John Street. We also have two historic properties, which are individual properties that are subject to similar restrictions on alterations of their properties. Our vote was 9 in favor, 2 opposed with no abstentions, with District 2 absent. Those voting against objected to the possibility that some owners might be restricted in what they could do with their properties against their wishes. Thank you.
Thank you. Doug Wells with the report of our Legislative and Rules Committee.
Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, we took this item up jointly with Land Use last Monday evening. Susan Richardson spoke on behalf of the Historic District Commission. The prior speaker covered the ground pretty well, except that I just wanted to point out that the restrictions as far as what can be done with the properties only is to the exterior. People can do what they want with the interior of the property, but it's the exterior that where there can be restrictions. There were members in our committee that were concerned about the possibility that there could be a minority of homeowners who would be restricted in what they could do with their property if two-thirds or more decided that they wanted to enter into this historic district. However, we are only at the study phase. This will come back to us at a later date when we could hear from homeowners who felt aggrieved by this process. In any event, we took a vote as to legal order. Our vote was 11-0-0 with District 3 absent.
Thank you. Discussion on item 16. Are there any comments to be addressed to the Community Development Block Grant items 2 and 3? If not, I will close the public hearing on those 2 items and ask the district chairs to please mark your voting cards. Combined items 2, 3, and 16, and proceed to poll your delegation. I have the results of the vote on the consent calendar items. Those were items 4, 8, 11, 13, and 14. Those in favor, 180. Opposed, 1. Abstaining, 1. Those items have carried. Continuing with the remaining items, item number 1 is the first of our separate items. We now just have items 1, 7, and 12 remaining. Item number 1 is a motion offered by our Land Use Committee, which came before us in September. We moved to postpone it to tonight, so it is now therefore before us. Mr. Bloomer, Chair of our Land Use Committee.
Actually, the postponement was before it was moved, so I will move it now.
Well, Mr. Bloomer, my recollection and our minutes reflect that it was after. So,
would you like me to read the resolution?
Well, you're free to, but I'm calling on you now to give your committee report.
Okay. This is a sense of the meeting resolution, as the moderator said, which has been offered by the Land Use Committee. There's a fairly complete explanation of this item in the expanos. I'm not going to repeat what's in what's in that statement, but I'd like to kind of go back and talk about why this item is before us and why it's before us now. It's before us now because the Planning and Zoning Commission is about to begin preparation of a new plan of conservation and development, which would replace the plan which was adopted in 1998. And incidentally, I'm simply going to refer to the plan as the POCD. For those of you who weren't around when we approved the 1998 POCD, I'd just like to describe the issues that we faced at that time. There were essentially two issues. The first was that the plan was not implementable because it failed to specify in sufficient detail how its goals would be achieved. A former member of the Commission described the plan as an aspirational plan. With all respect to that individual, this is a bit of an oxymoron because a plan is not a statement of aspirations or goals. According to my dictionary, it is a scheme, method, or design for the attainment of some object. It's not a plan if it merely states goals. It's not a plan if it does not say how its goals are to be achieved. The second issue that we faced back in '98 was keeping the plan current, which required periodic updating. And both these issues had come up before the POCD reached the RTM, and they are dealt with in the plan itself. And I'm just going to read two sentences from the plan. The town planner will work with appropriate town departments and groups to develop an implementation plan within 6 months of RTM approval. The Commission will review and revise the plan at periodic intervals in an effort to make the town a better place for today's citizens and their children. When the RTM took up the item, we appended to the resolution that formally adopted the plan two further resolved clauses. The first of these reads, "The Commission shall develop an implementation plan and forward such implementation plan to the RTM through its Land Use Committee for consideration and approval as an addition to and as part of the 1998, not later than a certain date." This was done in the sense that an implementation plan was in fact prepared and presented to the RTM, but that implementation plan was little more than a table listing all of the recommendations contained in the plan and identifying the town department or agency that would implement it if it were implemented. There was no effort made to describe what had to be done to implement the various recommendations. The second part relating to a periodic updating, the RTM further resolved clause said that the Commission will conduct such review, that is to say, the review intended to revise and update the plan biennially in cooperation with the Land Use Committee of the RTM prior to the town meeting to be held in October of 2000 and every year thereafter. That has happened. The reviews intended to keep the POCD current have taken place. The fourth of those reviews will take place on Thursday evening, this coming month, in November 16th at 7 p.m. in the Cone Conference Room in Town Hall. And I hope many of you will be there. But following the three reviews that have already taken place, no revisions of the plan have been made, although recommendations that needed revision were identified. The 1998 POCD has not had much impact on the town except in connection with zoning. Indeed, a former chairman of the BET stated that we don't pay much attention to the POCD. The first two forks of the Land Use Committee resolution address these two issues. They call for a more detailed and comprehensive plan. They call for periodic updating. The feedback that I've gotten from committee reports and discussions with other members suggests to me that these two parts of the Land Use Committee recommendation are relatively uncontroversial. Those opposed to the resolution don't like the third part, which seeks to link the POCD with the capital plan. It does so by requiring that projects included in the capital plan must be in the POCD as revised and updated. The theory is that so long as funding flows from the capital plan without reference to the POCD will remain an irrelevance. The capital plan is not prepared with anything like the public input or transparency that is required in connection with preparation of the POCD. Items included in the capital plan too often do not reflect a consensus of town citizens. The best example, or at least the most recent example of this, is the Benedict Place parking structure, which got to a very advanced stage of development before we shut it down last month by a 3-to-1 margin. The procedure required for preparation of the POCD makes this very much less likely to happen. The third fork of the resolution, however, is opposed both by the Planning and Zoning Commission and the First Selectman. I'm particularly troubled by the opposition from the Planning and Zoning Commission. The resolution seeks to get the Planning and Zoning Commission to exercise its planning obligations more effectively. The Planning and Zoning Commission is the town's planning agency, and it is widely conceded that the town does not plan effectively.
Mr. Boutel, please state your point of order.
I'm not sure I'm hearing a committee report, sir.
Is this a committee report, Mr. Bloomer?
This is a committee report. This is an item which has been put before the
No,
RTM
I mean, it's just-
by the
yes,
committee.
If it is,
Yes.
it's a committee report. Continue.
A study of the land use agencies in the 1990s recognized that the town was not planning effectively and considered dividing the planning and zoning functions into separate agencies. This has been done in Stamford and in other Connecticut towns. Instead, the study recommended that a full-time planner be added to the P&Z staff, but this was never done. The Commission rightly says that it does not have the resources to do what the Land Use Committee resolution calls on it to do. Part of the answer to that is that there are no free lunches in this world. If we want better planning, it's going to cost something. But more effective planning should also result in cost savings because it is less likely that taxpayer money will be spent on projects for which there is no consensus. The Planning and Zoning Commission also argued that its power in granting municipal improvement status to projects will be diminished if it must list projects in the POCD, because inclusion of those projects in the POCD would imply MI approval. This is truly a spurious argument. It's like saying that the RTM's power not to fund a project is diminished by approving a plan that includes the project. Neither the Commission's nor the RTM's right or power to change its mind would be diminished by more detailed planning. The First Selectman has also opposed the Land Use Committee resolution, mainly on the ground that it sets up a cumbersome procedure. I'll let him speak for himself, as I'm sure he will, on this point. But I would point out that the CIP committee, which determines what goes into the capital plan, consists of members of the town administration, most of whom answer to him. Public input is from neighborhood associations and other community groups who express their views to him. Absent is the structured public hearing process that goes into the plan of conservation and development. The town charter sets up a planning process that the town is not following. In this vacuum, the capital plan has de facto become the primary planning document for the town. For example, when the Board of Education decided that it wants to build a new headquarters south of the Havemeyer building, the first thing it said was that the first thing it wants to do is get the project into the capital plan. And you heard Mr. Richardson say this evening that the Nathaniel Wither Board is looking to get its proposed plan into the capital, its proposed project into the capital plan. Both of these projects, and indeed all other major capital projects, should be looked at in the context of a comprehensive plan. Our town charter specifies that the plan of conservation and development is that plan. I urge you to support this resolution. If it is defeated, We can expect the Planning and Zoning Commission...
Mr. Bloomer, let me just remind you, you are giving a committee report, so this is not a personal statement. So, you mean the committee urges you?
Yes, that is indeed what I mean. I'm on my last paragraph. If this is defeated, I think we can expect the Planning and Zoning Commission to give us another aspirational plan. If that is what we get, we can expect that it will get no more respect than did the 1998 plan. Oh, votes. In June, when we voted to put this item before the RTM, our vote was 8 in favor, 2 opposed, no abstentions, with districts 3 and 6 voting against. We voted again on Monday evening, and that resulted in a closer vote. There were 6 in favor, 5 opposed with no abstentions. The same 2 districts, 3 and 6, were opposed. In addition, 2 former members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, representing districts 10 and 11, voted against, as did District 8. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Boutel, please state your point of order.
I'm sorry, Mr. Boutel.
Mr. Bloomer, he's addressing a point of order to me. The committee report is over. Although you make some valid points, there is nothing that I need do now except call for our next committee report. Which of our pending committees would like to go next? Doug Wells, Chair of our Legislative and Rules Committee.
I'll go next with some trepidation after what was said. This is the report of the committee. We have taken this item up twice. We first met on September 11th when this matter came before us, and we met again subsequently on October 16th. The item in September was presented by Franklin Bloomer on behalf of the Land Use Committee in a joint informational session with Finance, Public Works, and the BOC. Mr. Bloomer offered this resolution as being designed to improve the planning process in town. He pointed out that the resolution would provide another layer of oversight and would compel the Planning and Zoning Commission to update the plan of conservation and development and to include projects not already scheduled in the capital improvement plan. The sum and substance of the concerns discussed in the joint session was that this resolution would serve to slow the P&Z process down considerably because considerable time and effort would be needed to update the POCD. Mr. Bloomer responded that he believes this would be worth it in order to have the RTM involved more closely in the planning process. Several RTM members spoke, including Mr. Kroll, Mr. Didakis, Mr. Tuttle, Mr. von Kaiserling. Our first selectman, Mr. Lash, also spoke, and it was his opinion that this resolution was not a wise policy. He believes that it is not the method by which to obtain better planning from the P&Z. We took 2 votes on the matter in September, one as to legal order, and we also took a vote as to the merits, since we were only one of 2 committees other than the committee offering this to consider it. Our vote as to legal order was 11 in favor, none opposed, with District 3 absent. Our vote on the merits in September was 3 in favor, 8 opposed, with District 3 absent. The negative voters believed that this added an unnecessary burden and additional cost to planning and zoning, and didn't necessarily provide the RTM with greater access to the planning process. We again took this item up last Monday evening. The only additional information was that presented by way of an explanatory document in 2 additional paragraphs provided by Mr. Bloomer and his committee. We also heard from Diane Fox at this October meeting, and she presented our committee and the Land Use Committee with a 5-point letter, a memorandum from Planning and Zoning about their concerns for how this would be implemented, the additional budgetary dollars that would be necessary for the increased workload and staffing necessary to work through this resolution if it were to be passed. We took another vote after getting this additional information last Monday evening. Our vote as to legal order was 9 in favor, 1 opposed, with 1 abstention, District 3 absent. On the merits, our vote this time was none in favor, 11 opposed, no abstentions.
Thank you. Before I call for the next committee report, I'd like to report the vote on our combined items. Those were items 2 and 3, the Community Development Block Grant, and item 16, the Historic Study Committees. Those in favor, 185, opposed 1, abstaining 1. Those items have carried. Continuing with the committee reports on item number 1, Pam Frederick, Chair of our Finance Committee.
Okay, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, the Finance Committee met in a joint meeting with Legislative and Rules and Land Use. I will give an abbreviated report because I think most of the substance of those meetings and a lot of the discussion was covered by both those committee reports. The Finance Committee originally voted on this in September, and I think that the views of the committee was not changed much since that time. The item was originally submitted, and the primary concern then were the cost and complexity of implementation. While the committee is supportive of the ultimate goal to have more and earlier involvement of the RTM in the approval of capital projects and to have them more fully integrated in the town plan, it was felt that this resolution appears to complicate the review process rather than improve it. And I think that Franklin Boomer's focus on the 3 points and the fact that the third point is the one that probably brought the most concern is reflective of much of our discussion. The point raised, several points raised by Diane Fox could be summed up to say that she felt it would be very onerous to continually review and update the plan of conservation and development. As the committee also noted in September, we thought that it would be helpful to have had this concept integrated with other since-the-meeting resolutions presented by Paul Curtis and the Budget Overview Committee so that there is one clear and agreed path to be taken by the RTM on weighing in on capital projects. I understand that the Budget Overview Committee it has a plan in the works, and that will be presented to us shortly. In September, the committee voted 0-11-0 on this item. Similarly, for the October meeting, the committee voted 0-12-0 opposed to this item. Thank you.
Thank you. Who's next? Bob Cavee, Chair of our Public Works Committee. Gentlemen, why don't we have a seat in front?
The RTM Public Works Committee discussed the predecessor of item 1 when it appeared as item 10 on the September call. At that time, the committee vote was 4 in favor and 6 against. Our committee attended the joint meeting this past Monday, and our vote this past Monday on the current version as item 1 was 1 in favor, 8 against, and 2 abstentions. District 8 was against, 8 districts were in favor, Districts 2 and 12 abstained. District 4 was absent. The majority felt that the resolution did not appear to be the best way to obtain the desired result of better planning.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman, Chair of our Budget Overview Committee.
Good evening. This matter was not referred to the BOC, and at its meeting this month, the BOC did not consider this matter. So you might be inclined to ask why I'm in front of you.
The thought did occur.
And there is an answer. And the answer is we took up this matter at our own volition in September. And we considered it with care, and we were pleased to see the Land Use Committee stepping forward to engage the planning process in the coordination of the CIP process. We believe that planning is an essential factor in making the CIP process serve the residents of the town. We encourage this. The vote of the BOC in the matter was 8-0-0 with 4 districts absent. Thank you.
Thank you. Vincent DeMarco, Chair of our Transportation Committee.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members, this also was not referred to our committee. However, though it wasn't, we had a full discussion on the item for its relevance to planning and management of transportation in Greenwich and the implementation of improvements which members present believe are of serious concern. We also focused on the explanation in the resolution presented in the updated explanos, as we were already aware that there had been considerable resistance to the third objective of the resolution, which proposes the method of integrating the capital improvements program with the POCD. Most of the members agreed that this procedure would probably force the town to do more effective planning, but has little chance of being carried out, and you know the reasons why. Resistance from the town planner and from the first selectman. There was a consensus that the main objective, as explained in the explanos, is probably too strong for most people to approve at this time, but even if that language were eliminated, the resolution might pass and would still move the town a step in the intended direction. The committee decided against drafting a substitute resolution, however. Members believe Stamford and possibly other Connecticut municipalities have integrated their CIPs with their town or city plan, but we were not sure at that point to what extent. The committee did, however, consider documentation referred to in the explanos indicating the integration of capital improvements programs and the municipal master plan in the state of New Hampshire. This documentation included a summary of the duties of municipal planning boards in New Hampshire and also the state statute regarding options by which municipalities may establish a capital improvements program in that state, one of which is that the legislative body may authorize the planning board to do so. No members spoke against the CIP program itself, nor did anyone question whether Connecticut statutes require the RTM or the legislative body authorize the capital improvements program. However, the consensus of the members was that the capital improvements projects should be based on goals that are established by the citizenry. Those goals should be contained in the POCD, and therefore there should be coordination between the POCD and the CIP. The committee acknowledged the fact that the P&Z Commission has fulfilled its responsibility for soliciting the goals from the citizenry in creating the current POCD, but believes the Commission does not exercise its authority and has not to direct planning so as to achieve those goals, as it is saddled with never-ending applications for approvals of private developments. It was also noted that the town charter regarding the town plan, sections 92 through 98, was created by special act in 1951 and appears to have had no revisions since then, while the state statutes on the same have been amended numerous times since then in consideration of changing circumstances. In summary, the committee unanimously agreed with the intent of this resolution and would support the appointment of a special committee to determine a workable process to integrate the CIP with the POCD.
Thank you. Mr. Huffman, are you looking to add something to your prior report?
No, I'm waiting to speak on the matter.
Mr. Brady? Okay, so that completes the committee reports on item number 1. Discussion on the item. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady?
Lack of a plan. I urge you to vote for this resolution. It's a sense of the meeting resolution. It asks the planning department to comply with the charter and identify and recommend where public improvements should be made in town in accordance with a plan which is developed by the planning department, subject to public review, hearings, and finally coming before us for adoption. As Mr. Bloomer pointed out, it avoids a situation where individual town departments decide where to build, with the RTM only coming into the act at the end of the cycle when it's asked for the money to build whatever it is. The second part of the resolution asks the CIP committee to budget the plan. And I note that as a POCD is presently prepared, this really isn't feasible because the POCD is not current. We all acknowledge that. But with a current POCD, there is every reason to believe that the town projects, whether they be recreational or new buildings or what have you, would be in the POC, would be in the plan, and the CIP should be budgeting what is in the plan, not something else. And those things that are in the plan should be in the budget at some time. The CIP committee still sets priorities, still determines when over the cycle, but the items are there. These appear to me to be very sensible actions, which as a town we should be taking. It summed up very simply in plan the work and work the plan. It seems really simple to me, although a difficult process to implement, but one we should be striving to achieve. So I urge you to vote for this item 1. Thank you.
Peter Berg, District 8.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good evening, fellow members. I'll be voting for this sense of the meeting resolution because it reveals a serious disconnect between our plan of conservation and development and our capital budget process. In critical areas like affordable housing, traffic and parking, and open space preservation, the capital plan bears no relation to the plan of development. Here are some specific examples. First, the plan of development calls for more affordable housing, both for the elderly and for those with low and moderate income. As you know, much of our town's workforce, from school teachers to police officers and firemen to retail store clerks, can no longer afford to live in our town. The town is a loser for this. We lose the economic diversity that distinguishes Greenwich from more homogeneous towns. As our workforce sprawls to Trumbull and Newtown, our state highways and our local streets are increasingly clogged with vehicle traffic. Our town has only half the number of affordable housing units the state requires, but our long-term capital budget includes no funds for housing, not even $1 for the 24 units of housing the town promised the state in return for the Coscob power plant property. Number 2, our plan of development recommends 6 solutions to the parking and traffic problem in our central business district, none of which has been fully implemented. In contradiction to our plan, the capital budget included funds to design an above-ground municipal parking garage. Last month, the RTM adopted a sense of the meeting resolution that finally put the brakes on that garage. And number 3, the plan of development recommends acquiring more open space and establishing a funding mechanism to acquire open space. Our town is far below the state's 21% goal for protected open space, even with our recent acquisition of the Tuckman property. But again, our capital plan provides no funds for open space. These are just 3 examples of how our capital budget fails to address the recommendations in our plan of conservation and development. The resolution before you calls for integrating our town plans. Better planning does not cost money, it saves money. I urge you to support this resolution. Thank you.
Mr. Huffman, District 7.
Thank you. I and several other members of BOC have been concerned as we have looked at aspects of the CIP process and the development of the CIP budgets in the last couple of years, and as we look forward into the next year, where we will be contemplating an additional $60 to $70 million in funded capital projects being appropriated, which follows in excess of $60 million that we approved in the current budget. We'll be seeing from the CIP committee a review of somewhere between 60 and probably 100 or more capital projects, probably in the neighborhood of the same number this year as last year, will be ranked at a level at which they will be recommended for funding. To do that in the absence of a planning process is foolish. As someone once said, if you don't know where you're going, it's hard to reach your destination. We need to develop a plan of conservation and development with implementation. We need it to look forward to how we want Greenwich to look, and we need it as we engage in this major capital investment in our town. Accordingly, I urge you to support this resolution and the forward-looking efforts of the Land Use Committee in developing one important element of our coordination with the CIP process. Thank you.
Jim Boutel, to be followed by Harry Labine.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members, I agree with prior speakers in that developing a plan and then working the plan is important, and I would be supportive of this item if it were consistent with the beginning of the explanos, that the revised explanos sent to us, on page 1 of which you were basically given an explanation what the resolution would do. And the third bullet there says that once the new POCD is in place, the capital plan prepared annually by the Board of Estimate and Taxation be derived from it and consistent with it. There is a big difference between being derived from it and consistent with it versus what's actually in the resolution. Prior speakers have spoken about open space. They've talked about affordable housing. Even if we passed the item as presented, it's not going to fix those problems. Affordable housing that gets built in this town is not going to come under our capital plan. The affordable housing that's being created may come through the Housing Authority. That's not in our capital plan. I chaired the Pomerantz Committee that created housing, turned the contemporary building there into group housing for residents of ARC, and make the full RTM aware that that committee has been resurrected as advisory to the Board of Selectmen now to look at the Seton House and the Tuckman property, and we may very well have a proposal coming forward on the Seton House. We also use our zoning to create affordable housing. You all have read in the paper about developers who come forward and have certain units set aside as affordable units. Again, you're meeting one of the goals, but it has nothing to do with the CIP. I've been on this body long enough that I remember when we talked about the parking fund when it was getting way up there, the comments came out, we don't want to get so much in a parking fund or a land acquisition fund that a buyer, a seller would say, well, you have $20 million in the fund, that's how much I want. We use contingencies or financing as we did with the Tuckman purchase, which we just recently passed, so that we don't have to carry a large balance in the fund. So not all of the goals that the POCD would set in place are tied to the capital fund. We criticize the capital improvement plan as not being in line with the POCD. Well, the capital plan isn't the only thing that affects the POCD. So I am fully supportive of the concept of it being derived from it and consistent with it. But you cannot put the capital plan in chains simply to serve the POCD. As the presenter of this item was talking about how we had revised it the last time the POCD came to us, I remember there was great concern when we talked about giving the Planning and Zoning Commission the authority to amend the POCD once we had adopted it. And I remember the discussion being, well, if it requires RTM approval, any amendments to it should require RTM approval. The resolution in front of you is saying it's the sense of the meeting that once it's adopted, it should be constantly reviewed and amended, makes no reference to it coming back to us. So why do we vote to adopt it if we're not going to vote on the amendments? So the resolution is flawed. In our districts, we may have heard discussion, well, it's only a sense of the meeting resolution. A sense of the meeting resolution should be far more than that. We should be specific on what we want. The statement was made earlier that we passed it and nothing happened. Well, if you take the attitude that it's only a sense of the meeting resolution and then criticize that things aren't being done, you've only got yourselves to blame. I am not going to support this tonight. I do support the concept of linking planning and linking capital improvements, but a number of those capital improvements also come by way of gifts. Turfing of the high school fields. Much of that was through gifts. Granted, there was money in the capital plan to pay for a portion of it, but it was initiated by gifts. A lot of our land acquisition, initiated by gifts. Those aren't part of the capital plan. So don't think that this is your be-all and end-all to linking the two.
Mr. Levine, to be followed by Mr. DeMarco.
Good evening. I would like to place some numbers behind the comments that have been made about the impact this will have on the Planning and Zoning Commission. In fiscal 05-06, the Commission held 41 meetings. That's somewhat over 3 a month. It processed over 900 applications. The rate of submission of applications and meetings continues at that same rate today. The P&Z staff is subject to the BET mandate that no one will be employed except to replace someone who leaves. Amending the POCD is not a casual affair. Public hearings must be held. I've attended a number of them. They're often very contentious. The Planning and Zoning Commission has always had a tradition of having neighborhood meetings, particularly where a CIP project impacts a particular neighborhood. Surely there will be neighborhood meetings. In other words, this will add substantially to the burden placed now upon the Planning and Zoning Commission. I think it's excessive, and frankly, I think it's unfair. Thank you.
Mr. DeMarco, to be followed by Mr. von Keyserling.
Mr. Moderator, I would like to offer an amendment to the resolution, so if the discussion isn't finished, it's
Go
up
right
to
ahead. Offer your amendment.
Would you like me to do that now?
Well, I've recognized you to
Okay.
do whatever it is you would like to do.
Thank you. Okay. I'd like to offer a motion to amend the resolution that all the language after the phrase in the fifth line and that be deleted and be replaced by the following. The moderator set up a special committee to consider how best to ensure that the capital plan prepared annually in connection with the plan's annual budget be consistent with the POCD as revised and updated from time to time. That's offered on behalf of the Transportation Committee.
Oh, it is?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Because that's offered on behalf of one of our committees, it does not require a second. I will read it again. This is in the fifth line, following the words "and that." It proposes to strike all that follows and replace it with the following language. And that the moderator set up a special committee to consider how best to ensure that the capital plan prepared annually in connection with the town's annual budget be consistent with the POCD as revised and updated from time to time. Discussion on that motion to amend. Mr. von Keyserling.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen. What we're talking about here is a policy of linkage, and I think this amendment greatly enhances the situation that my friend Mr. Boutel had a problem with and others. After all, what we're trying to do is establish a process, a policy of a process that the administration and the people whose job it is to affect these things, give them guidance. I was concerned with Mr. Levine's comments in his many good years of service in the P&Z that he felt that they were overburdened as it is now. I find that a sad comment, which has always bothered me over the years, that we have not given enough support to our planning and zoning to really allow it to do the job of planning, which it's supposed to be doing. And we need that planning, and to say that we can't do planning because we don't have the wherewithal, I think is being juvenile on our town's part. I don't mean the P&Z's part. They're struggling with, valiantly, doing an excellent job with what they're given, but I don't think we give them what they need, and we are the ones who suffer. I would say that coming to this amendment, the reason I'm saying this amendment, it purifies the motion as a sense of the meeting, and I think sends the message. It's good that good town planning saves money for us, has been said before, and it's a best business practice. First, you plan what the town infrastructure is so it coordinates. You don't want to pave a road, and then we've seen before, again and again, they come along, dig it up, put a pipe in it. This kind of disassociation of planning. So we should first plan the infrastructure and then plan the finance for it. Otherwise, we're going to be nickel and dimed and piecemealed into it, as we always in the RTM have complained about. In April RTM, you may remember that we passed a sense of the meeting on the CIP plan then. Quite strong support, saying that we wanted to have the full information by this September for the committees in the RTM of the CIP plan going forward for this next year. I don't know that members of this body have been satisfied with the information that they've gotten at this point. Many of us are not. And I don't know if you feel that you can really able to speak for your electors' best interest without that information. So I would say to you, plan first, finance second, and vote yes for this this amendment and the resolution as amended. Thank you.
We are now discussing the Transportation Committee motion to amend, which suggests that there be a special committee set up. Further discussion on that motion to amend? Dr. Carlson, District 1.
Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM, this proposed change in item number 1 is different from what was put before us by Mr. Bloomer's committee. I think there may be some virtue in this proposal. However, that I think it would be much better if item number 1 and the proposed amendment were referred back to the Land Use Committee. Mr. Moderator, would it be appropriate to make a motion to refer it back at this time or somewhat later?
It would be appropriate at this time.
Therefore, I make a motion to refer both item number 1 and the proposed amendment back to the Land Use Committee.
Is there a second? It has been moved and seconded. Well, let me state the motion before us. It has been moved and seconded to refer item number 1 and the pending motion to amend back to the Land Use Committee. We will now take up discussion on the motion to refer. That does have priority to the pending motion to amend. Okay, motion to amend has the least priority of any other motion, essentially. Discussion on Dr. Carlson's motion to refer item 1 to the Land Use Committee. Mr. Basilewski, District 8.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members of the RTM, I was one of those people in the Land Use Committee that actually voted against the original proposal for the reasons that you heard. I had difficulty with the notion of being able to not really fully implement the motion as proposed. You heard from the problems from the P&Z, etc. I believe that the Transportation Committee's proposal addresses that particular issue by creating a committee to address those particular points. I don't think, frankly, I have trouble understanding if this matter gets referred back to the Land Use Committee, what we're going to do with it. It's nice to refer it back to us, but we haven't been instructed what we're supposed to do with it once we get it. We can return it back to you in its present form, and it seems to me that you've wasted effectively 2 months under those circumstances. I think there's enough here. You've heard enough from various viewpoints expressed this evening to permit this thing to go forward in a rational way. We've done it before. We've had excellent work with Mr. Richardson's committee with Nathaniel Witherell. This body has shown that it can create committees that address issues in a rational way, that conduct fact-finding, and that arrive with resolutions that are logical and that permit us to make a determined and a decision on the basis of some fact. So I would urge you to vote against Dr. Carlson's motion and to take up the motion of the Transportation Committee on its substance. Thank you.
Further discussion on the pending motion to refer. Mr. Porter, District 6.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I stand before you in support of Dr. Carlson's motion. I've listened many times to various perspectives about planning, and I bring you my own perspective, and that's the reason that I support Dr. Carlson's motion. There have been times in corporate environments when entire planning departments have been eliminated. When they've been eliminated, it's been clear to the management of corporations and other entities that everyone at the management level understands that planning is work that every manager does. One definition of the pieces of work that managers do is planning, leading, organizing, and controlling. Controlling being the word for saying that all managers need to be accountable for the objectives and goals that they've set. Now, we've danced around tonight, I think pretty seriously, the whole notion that the sentiment of this body is that there needs to be some plan that allows us as Greenwich to differentiate ourselves from the rest of the world. It may be the plan of conservation and development. It may be some other plan. But if it is the plan of conservation and development, then one way or another, every effective manager needs to integrate their budget, their vision, and how they differentiate themselves favorably on behalf of their constituents in some form. And if it is the plan of conservation and development that is that master document, then it seems to us we need to all realize that, and referring it back to the committee would, I think, help them broaden their perspective about what other alternatives there are besides the plan of conservation and development. If there are none other, and if from the input from the Board of Selectmen, the BET, and others, which I assume they would solicit, there are none others, then I would suggest that we go forward pretty much as that committee had recommended. But I'd first like to know what the alternatives are. For that reason, I urge you to vote in favor of Dr. Carlson's motion.
Further discussion on the motion to refer. All right, I will call for a voice vote, this being a procedural matter. If you are in favor of sending this back to the Land Use Committee, you should vote aye. If you are opposed and would like to continue discussing the Transportation Committee's motion to amend and thereafter the item on its merits, you should vote no on this motion to refer. Are we clear? Okay. All those in favor of Dr. Carlson's motion to refer, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? No. Motion has failed. Continued discussion on the Transportation Committee motion to amend item 1. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards? Transportation Committee motion to amend item number 1. Once again, this is to add language to have the moderator set up a special committee to consider how best to ensure that the capital plan prepared annually in connection with the town's annual budget be consistent with the POCD as revised and updated from time to time. So we will need to await the result of that vote before we could vote on item number 1. Are there any other interested speakers in addressing item number 1 as we take this vote on the motion to amend only? Any other speakers? All right. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Crumbine? Yes, we can continue with the substance of the... We don't know yet whether this amendment has been adopted or not, but... Peter Crumbine, our selectman.
Good evening. I'm not necessarily opposed to the amendment, but I'd like to just say a few words about the substance. I'm a little troubled by this, and I'm troubled primarily by some key words that Jim Boutel said. He said that, do you really want to chain the CIP process? The CIP process goes out 10 years. In fact, it's about to be extended to 15 years. If that isn't a plan, I'm not quite sure what is. Mr. Bloomer is concerned that our CIP program, our CIP plan, is inconsistent with the plan of conservation development. Well, that was done 8 years ago, and what it really says is that on a year-by-year basis, we have different needs, and we've decided to do things a little differently than we decided in the POCD 8 years ago. So I think you ought to think very carefully if you want to pass something that's going to lock us in the future. This is apart from the problems that Mr. Levine mentioned, that the burden it places on the planning and zoning. Just the basic idea, do you want to lock yourself into something for the future? Thank you.
Further discussion on item number 1 as a whole? Mr. Basilewski?
I think what we just heard, at least from my viewpoint, bears a response. There is a fear that was expressed that in some fashion we are being locked in, that we will not be in a position to respond to changing circumstances. The Land Use Committee's resolution attempted to address that issue by requiring periodic updates. Theoretically, at least, that would respond to changing circumstances. The issue or the notion of planning is not inconsistent with dealing with changing circumstances. But one thing that has been a consistent criticism that I have heard of the CIP program is that neither this body or the town citizens, as represented by this body, have a sufficient input into the project, into the chain of projects that get put into this CIP process. And so the result is you can get a disconnect. That disconnect will and could and does on occasion result in waste, in dollars spent for consultants, for planning, which then turns out to be wasted when everybody sits up and says, my God, you know, we really don't want this project. This has happened on numerous occasions. We've had projects brought to this body in my 10-odd years here where the sole justification for the project was, well, we've already spent $250,000 on it. Nathaniel Witherell, in its early incarnation, if you will remember when they were working for their certificate of need, that was it. Every year we had $100,000 because we had to do the certificate of need if we don't have it. Now, all of which, by the way, were good goals. I mean, we all agreed that, yes, without a certificate of need, the whole process of Nathaniel Witherell and its ability to restructure and rebuild, etc., would be seriously damaged. But it's a little bit like the horse being put in front of the cart. And what the planning process, if it's well done, is intended to do, at least, is that you build consensus in the community for a project, and then if you do that, it strikes me that everything else begins to fall into place in a much more orderly and easy fashion. You're not going to have an argument about whether you want to spend $250,000 on a consultant if everybody's in agreement that this project has been identified, it's been worked out, and there's a need for it, and a consensus has been built. The planning process is to a certain extent a semi-political instrument because it is intended to create that consensus and identifies needs. The other thing is, frankly, the identification of needs, I happen to believe, oftentimes is better if it's from a bottom-up rather than from a top-down. If the neighbors, if the people of this town are in a position to express their views on what's needed in the town, it strikes me that those in leadership positions in this town have a much easier job. I mean, they are being brought projects to them by the people who are directly affected by those issues. We've had, again, examples, Lockwood traffic calming, that has been around for how many years now? I mean, things of that sort. So the planning process is not inconsistent with the idea of handling emergencies, with the idea of dealing with changing circumstances. But what it does do is it creates a bigger vision for the town. It creates some measure of structure within which you can promote capital projects, and it gives a stake in those capital projects to the citizens of this town. It gives them, in effect, an ownership in those projects, rather than having the feeling, as has occasionally happened, that these projects are imposed upon them, and nobody understands why or how that happened, other than the fact that there's $250,000 have been spent on consultants, and the consultants said it's appropriate. So I think it's not inconsistent. The Transportation Committee's approach, it seems to me, is a good one in the sense that all they're saying is, let's create a committee, let's study this, let's come up with a reasonable, and by the way, why the Transportation Committee proposal as it being a committee appointed by the moderator, as opposed to being referred back to the the Land Use Committee, is for the simple reason, the same way it was done with Nathaniel Witherell. This committee should be across the board, across the entire RTM. It should have input from every committee, from the Finance Committee, from the Budget Overview Committee, from the Land Use Committee, because they're all impacted by what we're doing here in the context of this plan of conservation development, and it strikes me that that's a perfectly rational way to proceed. It's not inconsistent, as I say, with handling emergencies, and I beg to differ with my eminent first selectman here. I don't think it locks us into anything, particularly if the committee comes up with a rational way to update this plan, which, again, was one of the goals of the Land Use Committee. Now, I happen to have disagreed in the way it was done because I thought it was locked it in, but if this is a system that's permitted to be worked out and the details worked out, I think we all stand to benefit.
I have the results of the vote on the motion to amend offered by our Transportation Committee. Those in favor, 134, opposed 49, abstaining 3. That amendment has now been adopted and is part of the resolution we are now considering. Further discussion on item number 1. Sir?
I just wanted to make one comment about the process by which we acquire and pay for a lot of professional talent, a lot of the expensive professional consultants in this town for a number of projects over the years. I've lived here my whole life, and I'm staggered by the number of professional consultants and the fees that we're being charged that result in absolutely nothing being accomplished. One of the things we have in this state is a great university system, and I've been around the country on a number of occasions participating with student design and development programs where students and universities are very, very capable and very willing to involve their professorships under being the guidance over their student bodies to participate in a number of engineering, design, and development programs from transportation, infrastructure, architecture, city planning, and other efforts that we're all trying to somewhat get a handle on in this town, and we have not, and to my knowledge, ever used that as a resource here by this town, but we do seem very capable, and I don't know the process by which we do hire and find these professionals, but I would suggest as a general rule that in the future part of our policy and procedure for projects and looking for intelligent input that we do address the university systems in the state and outside the state, reaching into Massachusetts, MIT, Rhode Island School of Design, Pace University,
Sir,
UConn.
are you discussing item 1?
That's just my input into the process.
Thank you. Further discussion on item 1. Mr. Bloomer, District 5.
Two very quick points. First, Mr. Boutel was concerned about the changes in the POCD. They would have to come back to us. The POCD could not be amended without the RTM acting on the amendment. The Planning and Zoning Commission cannot amend it unilaterally. So that I just wanted to clarify that point. The second point was Mr. Levine's point about the extent to which the Planning and Zoning Commission is overwhelmed by the zoning obligations that it has. This is undoubtedly true. The Planning and Zoning Commission has a huge burden, but we cannot not have effective planning because our planning agency is absorbed in doing a job which is separate from planning, namely its job in zoning. So that if we are going to have, if we are going to plan effectively, if we are going to go forward with some version of this resolution, I would acknowledge that it will require giving the Planning and Zoning Commission the resources it needs, or conceivably splitting planning off into a separate agency. Thank you.
Further discussion on the pending resolution, item number 1. Arlene Lamazzo, District 6.
I'm sorry, it's not my intent to drag this out any further, but I just voted favorably for that amendment and then realized that some of us have in our mind the explanatory, which we all said, or many of us said, we could support the first 2 bullet items, that the plan of conservation and development currently being prepared should be comprehensive, more detailed than it was in the past. I didn't have a problem with that, and I think some of you didn't either, that it be revised and updated so that it remains up to date throughout the 10 years before, and so on. But if you look at your resolved clause in your call, be very careful to reread that before you vote, because the resolved says that it's the sense of the meeting that the plan of conservation and development being prepared by the Planning and Zoning Commission describe all capital improvement projects required to achieve its goals. Well, that really folds the CIP right into the POCD, and I would urge you to be careful of that, because that's not what it says in the explanatory. There's a disconnect between these two. Thank you.
Dr. Carlson, District 1, speaking on item 1 as amended.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members, I think Mr. Bloomer's proposal here is very purposeful. This is good for the people of Greenwich. I'd like to just read something in the text of the resolution. I read, revised and updated with appropriate citizen input at periodic intervals. Those words, appropriate citizen input, to me are very important here, and I think they're very well worth voting for. The capital improvement plan is going to create some problems for an awful lot of middle-class people. We are a democratic organization, and we depend on the electors of this town. Anything that opens up the CIP to a stronger discussion among the people of the town, and especially those people who would be most affected by it, is good. So this amended resolution is a step in the right direction, and I urge you to vote for it.
Further discussion on item 1. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards, item number 1 as amended, and proceed to poll your delegation. The next item to come before us is item number 7. May we have the resolution on that item? Peter Crumbine, our selectman.
Resolved that the following named person nominated by the Board of Selectmen be appointed a member of the Board of Parks and Recreation for a term expiring March 31st, 2010, Winston Robinson.
Will the member please move the adoption of the resolution? The resolution on item 7 has been moved and seconded. Colleen Jenkins with the report of our Appointments Committee.
Winston Robinson is renominated to the Board of Parks and Recreation. Our vote was 10-0-0 in favor of his nomination. Winston possesses a wealth of knowledge about the Parks and Recs facilities and programs. His institutional knowledge is good for the board, particularly on a board that has a large supply of newly appointed members. In addition, Winston Robinson works with the Greenwich Housing Authority. Thus, he serves as a natural liaison between that group and the Board of Parks and Recreation. The vote again was 10-0-0. This was unanimous support of the candidate. Thank you.
Karen Sadek Khan with the report of our Parks and Recreation Committee.
Good evening. We interviewed Winston Robinson for the first time last Tuesday night. Excuse me. Mr. Robinson has served on the Board of Parks and Rec for 10 years, and during that time has served on various subcommittees of the board, including the Master Plan Committee, Parks and Trees Committee, and the Marine Committee. It wasn't clear to us if he had assumed any leadership roles on those boards committees during his 10 years. He explained to us during his 25-minute interview with us all the various projects and endeavors the board had undertaken during the 10 years that he'd been with them. He also commented that he feels his contribution is to appreciate all the resources in the town and to maintain those resources while not having them overdeveloped. He commented that new members of the board need substantial time to learn the scope of the large Department of Parks and Recreation's work, and he would be interested in assisting these new members in this learning process. Two members of our committee expressed their disappointment about the recent failure of the town to take advantage of the dredging opportunity due to the failure to complete permits in a timely manner. Of course, this had been the subject of an article on the front page of the Greenwich Time that day. Also, the subject of a report written by the subcommittee of the Marine Committee, called the Waterfront Committee, that had addressed the feasibility of Greenwich having a harbor management plan was brought up, and criticism was expressed over the fact that the report and its recommendations had somewhat been ignored by the board, even though Greenwich, of course, has the largest waterfront area in the state of Connecticut. When asked how he perceived his role on the new board, he answered to focus on the continued process of park bathroom renovations and to provide historical continuity for the board. While Winston has a broad knowledge of the board's work during his 10-year term, many members felt that since the Board of Parks and Recreation is only a 9-member board with a lot of work, it would be better served to have a member who would provide new resources and leadership rather than historical continuity. Hence, the concerns of our committee are reflected in our vote, 5-5. Districts 8 and 10 voted no. Abstaining were districts 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. Thank you.
Thank you. Discussion on item 7. Rick Crowell, District 8.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, fellow members. During the Parks and Rec subcommittee last week, some very refreshing words were used to describe a candidate's goal. accomplishment, and accountability. Two attributes that are so important in our professional lives are also those that we must carry forward to all public officials. Excuse me. History tells us that during the early years of this meeting, the commercial prices for shellfish or the schedule for commercial boats coming into the harbor would be announced. The waterfront was a critical part of then a commercial community. Currently, the POCD defines the waterfront as Greenwich's greatest resource. And although the commercial significance is all but gone, the waterfront is now at the center of both active and passive recreational needs of a different community. Yet, the Mianus River has not been dredged in 22 years, when the river is supposed to be on a 15-year maintenance plan. The town currently has no plan. There continues to be trouble with waterborne traffic and the Mianus River Railroad Bridge. In May 2005, a subcommittee was formed and submitted a report to the full Board of Parks and Recreation recommending a harbor committee should be formed. A year and a half later, no action has been taken on those recommendations. Since that report was submitted, the newspapers have reported that the town failed to secure the necessary permits for a dredging project in Greenwich Harbor, which now may be several years off and cost the town several $100,000 more to accomplish. That there are unpermitted moorings in our harbors. That the boat storage system was undergoing an internal audit and needed revamping. The introduction of a beach access policy for $1. That the commercial fishermen had no permits for their floats and nowhere to go. Not to mention that we have seen the Todd's Point boat ramp and adjacent parking lot turn into a collection or relic storage area. That the town is not in compliance with its stormwater permits, and that the town continues to allow pressure washing and other activities that are against EPA standards in its boat storage facilities. Why do I mention all these facts to you this evening? Number one, hopefully to open your eyes a little bit more. But more importantly, to the fact that Mr. Robinson served for the last 3 years of his 10-year tenure on the subcommittee for our waterfront. A long-time and respected member of this body gave me some good insight with respect to candidates for public office. I was told that, and I quote, "All those holding or seeking public office must be willing to accept criticism and even rejection based on the merits of their qualifications and performance. The RTM should assert itself to the full extent of its authority. That is our responsibility." I will be the first to say that I've known Mr. Robinson to be a perfect gentleman and an all-around good person. I understand that Mr. Robinson is a lifelong resident and that his heart may be in the right place. However, we, as elected officials, must base our decisions on accountability and accomplishment. Therefore, I cannot support this candidate this evening. Thank you.
Further discussion on item 7. Dr. Carlson, District 1.
Mr. Moderator, fellow members of the RTM, there was much toil this summer by the Appointments Committee over these Parks and Rec nominees. Basically, a very small compromise was worked out by the vote in here last month. The Board of Selectmen did a very handsome thing in renominating Mr. Robinson. I think in view of the vote last month and what the Board of Selectmen did, that it would be very, very much out of line if we voted against Mr. Robinson. And I had hoped myself from the very beginning that he might go back to the Board of Parks and Rec. I ask you to please vote for Mr. Robinson, and I also move the previous question if that is not out of order.
Well, it is out of order. Not out of order, but the moderator will not accept that motion, particularly when it comes at the end of the speaker having his say but then trying to cut off other interested speakers. So, pursuant to our tradition of allowing members and guests to speak, and since there are others who have indicated a desire to speak, I will not at this time accept that motion. Further discussion on item 7. Joan Caldwell, District 10, to be followed by Mary Ferry, District 5.
Mr. Moderator, members of town meeting, as was reported by the chairman of the Parks and Recreation Committee, District 10 voted against the nominee. I had the vote that evening because our regular person couldn't attend. And I intend not to vote for the nominee. I made my concerns very clear that night. I believe in accountability. I come from a boating family, a waterfront family. I've lived in this town all my life, and I don't think we're taking very good care of the resource that we have. I think that we may have had a committee, but I don't know what the committee has been doing. Notwithstanding what the delegate from District 1 said, I understand that the Board of Selectmen very graciously brought Mr. Robinson's name back to us in an attempt to keep institutional memory on the board. But their willingness to do that does not buy my vote. I am not going to vote for anyone that I do not believe has done the best job he could do for the town. And I certainly do not feel that that's what happened here.
Further discussion on item 7. Mary Ferry, District 5.
I just want to point out to you that the Board of Parks and Recreation is strictly advisory, and any shortcomings that we have seen in boating, Parks and Rec, whatever, should be placed at the foot, or should be charged to the Parks and Rec Department. This board has no power as opposed to social services or some of the others.
Further discussion on item 7. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards, item number 7, and proceed to poll your delegation. I do have the results. I have not announced the results on item 1, correct? All right, the vote on item number 1, which was the sense of the meeting resolution offered by the Land Use Committee, those in favor, 120, opposed, 60, abstaining 4. That item has carried. Now, because that called for the creation of a special committee to be appointed by the moderator, I would ask for input from the Transportation Committee that proposed that amendment that we adopted, and the Land Use Committee, and any other committee that has an interest in the makeup of this special committee. Please give me your thoughts on what the makeup of that special committee should look like. And please do that in the near future. All right, that brings us to the final item on our call, which is item number 12. Dr. Susan Wallerstein of the Greenwich Public Schools.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Moderator, members of the RTM. Resolved that the representative town meeting of the town of Greenwich hereby approves the agreement between the Board of Education and the Greenwich Organization of School Administrators, GOSA, representing school administrators for the period July 1, 2007 to June 30, 2010.
Thank you. Will a member please move the adoption of the resolution? The resolution on item 12 has been moved and seconded. May we have the reports of the committees that consider this, beginning with our Finance Committee. All right, is Labor Contracts going to go first? Joan Caldwell, Chair of our Labor Contracts Committee.
Mr. Moderator, members of the town meeting, sorry about that. The proposed settlement between the Board of Education and the Greenwich Organization of School Administrators, item 12, is for a period from next July 2007, ending June in 2010. This evening, we will be voting to accept or reject the settlement. We are not being asked to appropriate any money because the Board of Education contracts, unlike other contracts, are done far enough in advance by statute so that the funds required can be built into the budget. Therefore, the sums required to implement this budget will come, or this contract will come to you in the budgets of 2007, 8, and 9. The contract covers 59 individuals. They are the principals, assistant principals, housemasters, headmaster, etc. The overall cost of this contract is 3.6% for the 3 years. It is within the BET's 4% guideline. That it calls for a GWI of 3.5% in each of its 3 years, which is slightly higher, 0.25% higher, than we are paying in the next year of the town contracts, that is, those negotiated by the First Selectman. However, it is in line with the contract that we negotiated with the teachers. The Board of Education met with the Labor Contracts Committee, members of the BET, and the First Selectman before it started collective bargaining, which is required by law. And at that time, the Board of Education, or the negotiating team, outlined 4 goals and objectives that it had going into these negotiations. The first was the reduction or elimination of incremental steps. This is something that has been long sought by the RTM. You've asked the Labor Contracts Committee time and time again, can't you get rid of the increments? They are, after all, nothing more than a raise on top of a raise. Well, this is the first time it was on an objectives list for negotiations. The second goal was the acceptance and institution of a performance evaluation system for the GOSA employees. Again, the RTM wanted to see some sort of performance evaluation of employees, and the Board of Education very definitely did. Third was the inclusion of a new health system, the retirement health system. Fourth, they wanted to have all of the contract changes come in within the guidelines set by the BET. The Board of Education and the negotiating team achieved its objectives. As stated, this contract over its life is 3.6%, well within the 4% guideline. Many of the savings that help them get to the 3.6 are achieved from the insurance savings in premiums, but we'll take it where we find it. Insofar as increments are concerned, this group has 5 steps. 1 step in each of the next 3 years will be eliminated. So at the end of the contract, GOSA employees will have only 2 steps. That makes it pretty close to the Teamsters, which has no steps. The performance evaluation system is or will be in place with the acceptance of this contract. It'll be functioning throughout the next school year, or throughout this school year, so that in the spring evaluations can be conducted and merit pay, it isn't merit pay, performance pay can be met out a year from now, however the board chooses to work that out. The evaluations will be conducted by administration staff. It will not be by members of the union, so it'll be the superintendent and the assistant superintendent. There are changes to the insurance program. The health savings plan, which we had hoped to get into our contracts, is now in this one. It makes it the first contract to have such a provision. Also, the health net plan. The contribution to the town on the premiums will be 7% and 4% respectively. Administrators who are enrolled in the point of service program or the preferred provider program, insurance program, will have their contributions increased next year, not this year, the second year of the contract, from 12% to 14% of the premium, and the following year from 14 to 15% of the premium. That's a big step for us, and it's the first in the town, and it sets the way for further negotiations on the town side. There are also increases in the amounts of the copay that will be funded by or handled by the employees. In addition, the work year is being increased from 195 to 225 days for the assistant principals and from 205 to 225 for the housemasters. The longer work week and work year has been something deemed important by the Board of Education. They were successful in getting it. Now, the Board of Education provided you with a very detailed explanation of the changes in this contract. I've gone over it thoroughly. It's excellent. It's easy to read, and it tells you the whole story far better than I can. Finally, I would say the committee has been very quick in past years to criticize where we have felt criticism was deserved, particularly of the Board of Education. We want to be just as quick to give them praise where we feel the praise is deserved, and it is deserved here. This is an outstanding contract. They did a good job. It deserves your support, and it takes the town one step closer in a direction we want to go. Our vote was 5 in favor, none opposed, to recommend your approval.
Thank you. Before calling for the next committee report, I do have the results of the vote on item 7, the appointment of Winston Robinson to the Board of Parks and Recreation. Those in favor, 86, opposed, 84, abstaining, 10. That item is carried. Mr. Brady?
Good evening. The Education Committee met last Monday night to discuss item 12. Bill Kelly, Susan Ellis, and Steve Anderson from the Board of Ed assisted with this item. I would only add one thing to what Joan reported from the Labor Contracts Committee, and that is that the evaluation evaluation plan is tied to an incentive compensation plan for groups of employees, so that within a school or in a group, a team, if that team achieves its goals under the plan to be provided, if they achieved 100% of their goals, they would receive up to an additional 1% compensation. The incentive compensation is fully funded as if everyone achieved 100% of his goals in each of the 3 years, and that still gave rise to a 3.6 average increase. Because of the way that it is structured, it is probably unlikely that all teams will earn 100% of the incentive. Our vote was 11-0-0, District 2 unrepresented, in favor of recommending adoption of this item. Thank you.
Thank you. Pamela Frederick with the report of our Finance Committee.
Okay, Mr. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, this item was presented to the Finance Committee by Bill Kelly of the Board of Ed, and we've had very thorough reports. The only thing that I would note is that the committee felt there were 3 very strong positives and is reflective in our vote. One, the addition of the performance-driven increase, we think is an excellent step. Reducing the steps to 2 by the end of the contract shifts the focus now more on performance versus longevity, and the third being the medical plans that are now more in line with the town's plans. Based on that, the committee was also pleased that the performance compensation component and the show of support of GOSA in their vote of 50 in favor, 9 opposed, was a strong support of this contract. The committee voted 12-0-0 in favor. Thanks.
Thank you. Discussion on item 12. Will the district chairs please mark your voting cards, item number 12, and proceed to poll your delegation? That being the last of the items to come before us tonight, we will await the result of this final vote before adjourning. I'd like to thank Paul Curtis and Jenny Larkin once again for bringing this meeting live to the town and for all the good work that you do. We have the result of the vote on item 12, which is the GOSA contract. Those in favor, 169. Opposed, 2. Abstaining, 1. That item has carried. There being no further business to come before the meeting, and absent objection, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all for coming. Have a very safe trip home.